I usually begin a class on modernism with a brief discussion of the meaning of the word modern. Not merely the meaning of the word modern, but also the etymology of the word modern. When I was a student, I thought that modern is a modern word, but now I know better. It was used for the first time in the 12th century in France, in French, with reference to architecture. Thus, modern is a medieval word. The medievals looked upon themselves as moderns. The word modern is related to the Latin root modo, which means now. I think the etymological meaning of the word modern is extremely relevant here. What is modern? Is that which is appropriate, that which is relevant to the present moment. The slogan of Ezra Pound was Make it new, make it new. This proclamation can be closely related to the meaning of the word modern because modernism is all about making literature relevant, appropriate to the here and now. It is generally accepted that the modernist period in English literature, in Anglo American literature, extends from 1890 to 1950. What led to the rise of modernism in English literature? There were a number of causes, number of reasons, and we shall try to identify the most important of them. The rise of industrialized towns, the miserable life of the working classes in such towns, the two world wars, especially World War One, the consequences of World War One, which included starvation, inflation, revolution, chaos, bloodshed, violence, class and gender struggles, the overall atmosphere of futility and pessimism. In his review of Ulysses of James Joyce, T.S. Eliot said that modernist literature attempts to capture, I quote, the immense panorama of futile anarchy, which is contemporary history, unquote. I feel like repeating the words of Eliot once again. The immense panorama of futile anarchy, which is contemporary history. Let us carry out a brief survey of modernist poetry and its features. Perhaps the most revolutionary achievement of modernist poetry was the replacement of traditional verse by verse libre. This meant that the poets discarded the metered line, the regular rhyme scheme, the stanzaic pattern, and chose to write in the free verse line. In modernist poetry, we come across an effort to shatter linearity. The traditional view of poetry is that a poem has a beginning, has a middle, and an end, and that the poem progresses in a linear manner from the first line to the last line. This was completely challenged by modernist poetry, which believed that whatever the poem has to convey has to be conveyed through a holistic vision generated by the entire poem. Modernist poetry was more image oriented rather than meaning oriented. The images dominated the poem and conveyed much of the meaning. In fact, meaning was conveyed more through images than through words. Modernist poetry relied heavily on symbolism. In Victorian poetry, for example, Practically everything is what it is. But in modernist poetry, almost everything is what it is not. The modernist poets were eclectic in sourcing ideas from different languages, different periods, and different civilizations. They went to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. They went to the Middle Ages. They went to India, China, Japan for inspiration. Finally, modernist poetry displays an obsessive interest in a certain set of themes, and these themes include the themes of loneliness, isolation, alienation, disruption, meaninglessness, anarchy, violence, bloodshed. The overall mood of modernist poetry was distinctly pessimistic. Of course, the colossus of modernist poetry in English is T.S. Eliot, and the wasteland remains the finest expression of modernism in English verse. He also made significant contributions to modernism through his poems like The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock and Four Quartets. To say that if Ezra Pound had not been there, there would have been no modernism in Anglo American poetry is only the exaggeration of a vital truth. It is a fact that the poetry of Pound does not have a fan following as large, as ardent as that of T.S. Eliot, but it is also a fact that Ezra Pound played a very dynamic role in unleashing the forces of modernism. He ran literary organizations. He published literary journals. He encouraged, supported, and advised fellow writers. He discovered and shaped the work of such writers as T.S. Eliot, Ernest Hemingway, and James Joyce. Of his own works, perhaps the most important is the Cantos, which is more a work in progress over the decades, evolving over the decades, rather than a finished book. A great poet who did not begin his career as a modernist, but who wrapped up his career as a modernist was W.B. Yeats. If you read his collected poems carefully, you will find in it a sustained movement towards objectivity and impersonality, which are the hallmarks of modernist poetry. Moving from poetry to fiction, we find that the developments in modernist fiction closely parallel the developments in modernist poetry. The first important development was the rejection of readability as an important feature of fiction. Earlier, the idea was that a novel has to be read by a very ordinary reader, understood or seemingly understood by him, and enjoyed or seemingly enjoyed by him. But modernism decided to discount readability. It believed that great fiction may sometimes be quite unreadable. Modernism led to the shattering of linearity in fiction as it led to the shattering of linearity in poetry. The concept before the rise of modernism was that every novel had a teleological movement, that it began telling a story in the first chapter and completed the story in the last chapter. This concept disappeared into thin air. There was a remarkable expansion of thematic frontiers in fiction, in English fiction, in Anglo American fiction, with the rise of modernism. Things earlier considered unworthy of fiction, such as ordinary things, such as everyday things, such as boring things, came to be looked upon as a subject matter of fiction. Modernist fiction was extremely frank in sexual matters. The rise of modernism led to the demolition of all moral taboos. The idea that logic should be the guiding principle, that reason should be the guiding principle, that organizes fiction was discarded. It was believed that there is not much of logic, not much of reason, not much of linearity in this world. And in order to capture the essence of this world, fiction has to give up logic, reason, and linearity. Of course, the greatest modernist fiction writer is James Joyce, and his novel Ulysses is to modernist fiction what the wasteland is to modernist poetry. Other important works of James Joyce include Dubliners and a portrait of the artist as a young man. Other significant modernist fiction writers include Virginia Woolf, D.H. Lawrence, and William Faulkner. There is no doubt that the archetypal device of modernist fiction is stream of consciousness. As the very name indicates, in the stream of consciousness method, the narrator attempts to portray the flow of the mind, the flow of the consciousness of the character. Stream of consciousness is the archetypal modernist device because in stream of consciousness there is a complete rejection of logic, reason, classification, organization, linearity, teleology, and the consciousness flow, the flow of the consciousness of the character is recorded exactly as it seemingly plays out. The developments in early 20th century drama in the English language are somewhat related to the developments in English poetry and English fiction. Of course, the most famous name in drama in the first half of the 20th century is that of George Bernard Shaw. George Bernard Shaw was fond of remarking thus: Shakespeare is the greatest dramatist in the English language, and modesty prevents me from saying who is the second greatest. I repeat, Shakespeare is the greatest dramatist in the English language, and modesty prevents me from saying who is the second greatest. Shaw authored such plays as Pygmalion, Man and Superman, The Apple Cart, Arms and the Man, Mrs. Warren's Profession. From across the Atlantic, from the United States, we have the trio of dramatists: Eugene O'Neill, who wrote Long Day's Journey to Night, Tennessee Williams, who wrote The Glass Menagerie, and Arthur Miller, who wrote All My Sons, and also Death of a Salesman. Modernist literature, poetry, fiction, drama was buttressed to some extent by the work of the early 20th century critics. And among these critics, the most important include T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, who, besides being very fine poets, were very fine critics as well. Another important critic was F.R. Lewis. These critics attempted to uphold modernist values such as objectivity, impersonality, unified sensibility, non-linearity in literature.